just want to start by framing the discussion here, thank you, Mark, around the importance of global governance. You know, for me, the case for global governance is very clear. First, you know, we need to recognize that like, you know, many scientific and industrial and commercial breakthroughs that came before it, AI is the product of cross-border collaboration. First, if you think about all of the materials that go into an AI system, they are sourced from across borders. When you think about the AI researchers who are contributing to not just the technology breakthroughs, but our deep understanding of the societal impacts of this technology, they live and work and collaborate across borders as well. The AI systems that we build are distributed across borders. So I think we have a very strong common interest in safety and security guardrails that are impermeable across borders. It's also the case that, you know, it is important in realizing our goal of having AI that serves all of the world and not just the global north, that we can easily move the technology across borders. There's not sort of compliance or technical barriers to making sure that technology can be adapted into local contexts and be culturally sensitive as well. So if the case for AI governance is clear and it needs to take place on the global level, the question then becomes how. And as we've just heard from Renata and also Gabriella, we are not living in an era where there is a single agency to rule them all. The model global governance environment involves a network of connected institutions, of some of which will be of the very sort of soft law variety and some of which will be of the hard law variety. So it becomes very important to think about how these institutions are going to work together. And as we noted in our HLab report, today there are basically three types of gaps at the global level. First of all, there are representation gaps, and you heard Renata cite the statistic, which I think is quite sobering, which is that 118 states currently have had no participation in any of the non-UN AI governance initiatives at the international level. There are coordination gaps. I think we're not fully harnessing the benefit of some of the initiatives that have been initiated to date because they are not fully coordinated. And then there are implementation gaps. So I think a lot of this conversation this week in New York with the prospect of the global digital compact and hopefully the contribution of the AI advisory body report that I was pleased to play a small role in will help to really spur this conversation forward. So with that framing, I would just love to first invite everyone on the panel to do three things. First, briefly introduce yourself. Second, give us your views on the state of AI governance. And then third, just give us a little bit of a lens into the role that you think international cooperation in particular plays. So Mark, we'll start with you.
First, thank you, Natasha. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, thank you to PAI and to, just to join all of you. It's a nice little homecoming to come back to PAI. My name is Mark Latonero. For those of you who I don't know already and hope to later today, I'm the head of international engagement at the US AI Safety Institute. Just before this role, I was at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, working on international AI policy, which included the President's executive order on AI. So that executive order elevates the role of international collaboration. It instructs the federal government to promote responsible AI safety and security principles and actions, including through key global conversations like the one we're having today and collaborations to ensure AI benefits the whole world rather than exacerbating inequities, threatening human rights, and causing other harms. That was a direct quote. And the EO, of course, states that in order to seize the benefits, we need to manage the risks. And I think that message has been really resonating globally in terms of global AI governance. So for example, last week I had the privilege of speaking at a conference on AI inclusion in Lagos, Nigeria. And while the practical need to tie in AI innovation and economic benefits was front and center for Nigeria and other countries on the continent, the sort of usual trope about the trade-off, dichotomous trade-off between safety and innovation that we've heard elsewhere wasn't really apparent. And our perspective at the US AI Safety Institute is that if we do manage the risks to safety, it will lead to trust, adoption, and innovation. And so that potential for economic and social benefits can flow from that. I would say that international cooperation is a key aspect of the Safety Institute. And I could talk a little bit about more of that later, but let me just say that the Safety Institute is housed at NIST, the Department of Commerce, and of course, NIST is a non-regulatory agency with scientific labs working on measurement science and research. And so the work that we do at the Safety Institute, which includes post and pre-deploy testing of models, advanced models and systems, and you probably saw our recent MOUs with Anthropic and OpenAI to do that, and do that fundamental technical research on risks and mitigations. That is science, and science can only be done through international cooperation. And so that's the sort of lens that we...
Yeah, thanks, Mark. 1C.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, Mark, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Wansi. I work with the Singapore government. My main role is to lead the work in AI governance. And that's really about thinking of how we can support our ecosystem in implementing AI in a trustworthy and responsible way, addressing some of the concerns around safety and risk. But ultimately, it's, as Mark said, everybody wants to be able to benefit from AI. So a lot of my work is international collaboration. Besides the domestic work, a lot of it is really working with people like Mark, Stephanie, organizations like Microsoft, Natasha. And because we recognize that it's important, right? Global cooperation is important. When we speak to a lot of other countries, and it resonates. I mean, what Mark said and what Renata said earlier, it resonates in terms of, one, many countries want to be able to benefit from AI. They want to be able to benefit from the opportunities that AI can bring to their economies, to their societies. But at the same time, of course, making sure that they want to manage the risk and manage and ensure that it's done in a safe and trustworthy way. And to do that at the international level, it's really translating into two parts, right? First, how do we make sure that we have common rules of the road, common norms? Because if we want our organizations, if we want companies to be able to deliver these products and services internationally, it's best if we do not operate in a world that's very fragmented. And that's where international collaboration comes in. It's important to drive that. For a small country like Singapore, we've been doing this in many other areas. It's not just in AI, in maritime trade, in aviation. That common rules of the road is really important, building those global norms. The other area that international collaboration can help is in building capacity. I mean, you heard Gabriella, you heard Renata, and even Mark and Natasha talking about it. How do we build capacity? And capacity can be done in different ways, right? It's not just about leveling up, from a very basic level, but also pushing the frontiers of science, building capabilities. And at all of these different layers, we need to help one another. So I'll talk a little bit more about Singapore's work later. But I thought maybe framing this in terms of, one, how do we come to some consensus on interoperability, on norms, that's important, and two, how do we work with one another to build and level up capability. Organizations like UN clearly have a role to play. It's very inclusive. But you also have other organizations like the standards bodies, like the Safety Network Institutes, Network of Safety Institutes, and many, many others. And while it's a very complex regime that we are sort of operating in right now, I think they all have different roles to play. And the key is how do we find, like Natasha said, right, the way to link them up and the way to coordinate better. And it's not just about countries, but also about organizations, but also about individuals and experts. It's a multi-stakeholder environment, so we really do need to pull all the strings together. Thanks.
Thanks, Wansi. Steph, let's get to you.
I would start by saying thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I was actually joking with 1C yesterday. It's like you've perfectly set up what I was going to say, but also I'm always so impressed when Singapore shows up in conversations, because you are doing so much work. I'm always like, do your team at home sleep? Like, how does Singapore do so much? It's so impressive. But I'm Ifayemi. I'm the head of policy at Partnership and AI. I joined Partnership and AI, I think, at the end of 2022, and my role was really coming on board to help build out a new policy team and a new policy portfolio for PAI, which has been very exciting working with Rebecca and the team. My work is really kind of looking at the fantastic research that many PAI colleagues are in the room have driven forward, and thinking about how that can really play a role in informing policy development. But more and more, a lot of the role that we want to play is also to think about and monitor and track how the policy environment is changing. And the report that John authored is really starting to do that. To what extent are we seeing changes in the policy environment, and to what extent are those changes aligned and connected? To what extent are we seeing new institutions, and to what extent are policy frameworks interoperable? So kind of building on what 1C said. So a few things that come to mind when I think about policy cooperation and the importance of policy alignment is, I think we've started to try and map out different parts of a kind of policy landscape, or stack, you might be able to call it. And you might see this image from us coming soon. And I'm looking at Amanda, because she's been trying to push us to publish this, but it has about 11 layers, all the way from the international layer down to kind of enforcing policy. And what's really interesting is, if you look at the policy regulatory stack in 2022, there were so many components that weren't there. And what we have seen, of course, and you've heard about this morning, is the emergence of the institutes, emergence of these new dialogues, et cetera. And so if I just take three parts of that stack, you take the international layer, the OECD, the UN, you kind of take the national layer, and you take the role of standards bodies. So I think traditionally, right, we've thought about the international layer as issue identification, best practice, kind of norm setting. And then you have the kind of national layer, where we have legislation, where it's really about issue definition, potentially, and also defining how you might implement policy. And then you have standards, which is around how do you actually do the implementation. I think the emergence or changes in the stack and the work that we're doing is, to what extent, as you add new layers into the stack, does everything still work? And something you'll hear in the report is, what if this stack and the ways in which they align, what if it breaks? And so just one example is, maybe if we started previously at the top with the international, now we have the safety institutes who might be doing more of that kind of issue identification, but also playing a role in best practices that we traditionally would have thought that the standards bodies would do. So what does that mean if the safety institutes are playing a role that we would have traditionally expected elsewhere? At the national layer and the standards body layer, I'm just going to take Europe as an example, where traditionally there's been a really nice link between European policy and Sensenelec, which Sebastian's in the room as the lead of JTC 21. And the European standards have this role in terms of providing a presumption of conformity as to how you implement European legislation. But now we have the code of practice, which I'm sure many folks in the room will be aiming to engage in, which doesn't have the same presumption of conformity or the same link to the international standards ecosystem. So what does it mean if you have this new code of practice, which isn't kind of formally linked to the rest of the stack? And what is the plan for the EU to bring that back to the international layer? So hopefully that resonated with some folks in the room, but all to say, I think we're just really interested in the linkages and how we can help use our research to inform how governments can think about the way the network could be improved.
Yeah, I think, look, we've got three really fantastic perspectives here with this ultimate challenge that we have, which is essentially, how do we bring together these different initiatives at different layers of the stack and make sure that they are in pursuit of shared objectives around inclusive progress in our AI future, and make sure that these levels of the regulatory stack actually interact well with one another. So let's stay right at the top to begin with, and pick up on some of the conversation from the prior panel about the UN. As the Secretary General is fond of saying, the UN has no money and no power, but it does have legitimacy. And that, I think, is very true and a core part of what the UN can offer here because of the inclusivity and the representation that it represents. So I'd love to briefly hear from all of you on, first, what are the promising opportunities at the UN level? And second, what are some of the challenges? Mark, let's start with you.
Let's see. Well, I won't sort of presume to tell the UN what to do. But let me just say that, the United States feels that the UN plays an extremely important and central and critical role, which is why we led a consensus resolution on AI, along with 120 other co-sponsors from member states from every region in the world. And this resolution, as you know, seizing the opportunities, you've heard that phrase before, of safe, secure, and trustworthy AI for sustainable development. And so, in that document, it essentially conveys that the need to ensure the benefits that AI reaches countries from all regions and all levels of development. It talks about capacity building, bridging digital divides, especially for developing countries. And so I think it does underscore, as Steph was saying, the sort of norm-setting capacity of the UN, that there is a consensus that AI systems can respect human rights and fundamental freedoms while delivering on aspirations of sustainable development. And these are fundamentally compatible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think Gabriella and Renata spoke a lot about how wonderful the UN can be, and I wouldn't get into that. But I think Singapore participates in all the platforms. We were part of the UNESCO negotiations for ethical guidelines. Remy, my colleague, sits in the H Lab with Natasha, and we believe the UN has definitely the ability to pull together all countries, right? It's the only platform that does that, amongst all the AI kind of conversations that I've had. So it's really important. I think some of and whether it's in terms of addressing capacity building, like RAM, as Gabriella was talking about, or in thinking about how do we deal with the science, I think the UN has a role to play. I think some of the challenges potentially could be when you have a large group, how do you make sure that what you do is relevant to everybody? I think as the GDC negotiations, as Renata was talking about, it's going to be difficult because you need to land on something. So finding that, which parts do we need to find consensus? Mm-hmm. Which parts can we say, hey, let's push because we have experts, we have people who can sort of set the tone, and we do not need to draft consensus in those areas. I think that's finding that balance is important. I don't envy the work of of colleagues in UN. I think again finding that connection, as I mentioned earlier, to the other platforms. Yes, that's also important. So let's see how we can move this forward together collectively and make sure that's going to be useful for all of us.
I just to echo everything everyone said, I think. It's been interesting. We've seen a lot of consensus amongst G7 countries, right? We had the Hiroshima Code of Conduct, which I think showed that the G7 countries were very much in alignment. And I think the GDC draft, at least from what we've seen, demonstrates a convergence at a higher level and within a wider set of countries, which is good, I think. There are a few things, including what we had earlier in terms of the recognition around the importance of science and new work to be done. There's a recognition of the need for continued foresight work and horizon scanning, which is fantastic. And I think also a shout out to so many people in this room. I think just hearing the UN talk about the importance of a socio-technical approach. I think this is something that we and so many civil society partners of ours have really pushed for at different levels, including in the US. So that was really fantastic to see that also converge at the international level too. In terms of the opportunities I think that the UN has, I think we've all mentioned it, we heard it earlier around the number of countries that the UN has the opportunity to bring into the discussion, which also includes countries with different geopolitical interests. So I can just say that, and you can imagine which types of countries I'm talking about. But to have them in the room on an ongoing basis to talk about critical issues, I think is really important. And to have that established as an established dialogue, which can't really go away for political reasons. But there's also other kind of sub-agencies of the UN, which I think positions it well and links to loads of parts of our work. So the ILO, I know my colleagues in our AI Labour and the Economy team have worked with ILO. They've done loads of work when it comes to AI and workers. So that's one example. You also have the ITU, which doesn't always get discussed. It's the UN's standards body. It technically is formally recognized as a part of the standards ecosystem. I think, looking at Sebastian, it's recognized also by the WTO, which is fantastic. So the UN actually has a formal route to standards to some extent, which is an opportunity. But I mean, just those examples, just thinking about those, the ITU is often also politicized. And it's often a debate amongst countries about how to use it just based on the countries that have more of a say there. So I think the benefit of having all the countries, and as you said, in terms of that there's a benefit there, but you also have to find consensus, which is difficult, and that will be whether it's in the General Assembly or whether it's part of the scientific panel or whether it's part of the ITU standards negotiations. And then the G7, I think, the communique we saw last year was good for us. I think we saw the G7 recognize the importance of worker well-being and labor. But if the ILO is also doing it, I mean, maybe to some extent they're already collaborating really well, but I think the more that the UN tries to do, to what extent is it going to have the mechanisms in place to also work with other entities that are also being forthcoming about their ambitions and potentially have gone first to some extent. So yeah, maybe it's just more of the mechanisms for bringing things together again, those linkages, and just an ongoing recognition about the difficulties of potentially achieving consensus.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the interesting things coming out of sort of a combination of the UK-led initiative to produce the International State of the Science report on advanced AI, the interim report, for which was released in May, and the recommendation of the high-level advisory body on AI that we hope will land in the GDC around creating a scientific panel, is that this poses a very real and I think important opportunity to demonstrate how UN-led initiatives can support and uplift work that might have initiated with a smaller group of countries. So I think this immediate opportunity that we have to define well how the work started by the UK and with a broader group of countries can be lifted up and not, you know, entirely subsumed by the UN work, but I think there's a real interplay there that has to be negotiated and an immediate opportunity to figure out how these pieces interplay with one another. So let's move for a moment to another important piece of the overall sort of regulatory infrastructure that has emerged, which are the AI safety institutes. Now, as many people in the room know, these were not even an institution within our vocabulary, really, a year ago. And now we have 10 AI safety institutes, and plus the AI office in the European Union as well. And Mark has been busy with his colleagues at the US AI Safety Institute in organizing the first international convening of a network of safety institutes that will take place in November. So Mark, can you talk us through a little bit some of the priorities that you have for that convening and that group and what you hope to achieve through that? And how do you see that network sort of building upon and helping to shape norms and sort of governance beyond the network itself?
Thanks for that question. Maybe I can back up just in case not everyone is completely aware. But in May, the leaders who were at the Seoul AI Summit agreed and endorsed something called the Seoul Statement of Intent towards international cooperation on AI safety science. At the same exact time, our Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, announced that we would help launch this network. And just 2 days ago, the Secretaries of Commerce and State announced that this first convening of the International Network of AI Safety Institutes will take place in November in San Francisco. the announcement announced the members, the 10 members, and that we will also be inviting experts from civil society, other countries, academia, industry to join part of that event because we want to ensure a robust view of where AI safety is. I'd say a differentiating factor, perhaps, with some of the other summits, for example, is that this convening will not take place at the kind of minister level. It's really going down to the scientists, engineers. When I say scientists, that includes social scientists, who are actually doing the work. Because the sort of cooperation around the science of AI safety, advancing the science of AI safety, what does that mean? Well, let's just be honest. If you were to sort of, evaluate the state of the science of AI safety today, it is developmentally immature. No one country or institute or one university or one company has all the answers, is aware of all the risks, knows how to measure those risks, and knows how to mitigate those risks and govern them as well. We do not have international and interoperable standards for AI safety. We don't know if a testing and evaluation plan used in one country will port over to another country, particularly with different languages and linguistic patterns. We don't have agreed upon metrics, benchmarks. We don't know how to interpret the results together, and we don't exactly know how to share those results once we have them. And so
we have just a few questions.
And so in November, in terms of priorities, I won't get ahead of what the network's priorities are because it will be the network to decide. Mm-hmm. But those priorities can only be developed and ascertained in partnership with other countries, civil society, industry, who are partners of the network, who are sort of observers and who are linked up to the network. And so you can imagine this network not as a closed network, but a network which sits within a network of networks, all working on safety standards, et cetera.
Yeah, I for one am very enthused about the network of safety institutes and the fact that it is a bringing together of, I think both technical and socio-technical talent. Social scientists are just as important as, technical experts in this discussion to really work on these hard measurement questions, which are foundational to us being able to manage the technology well. So the way I see that network is that it is kind of a shared investment in building some of the infrastructure that I very much hope many more countries beyond those in the network today will be able to leverage going forward. So Steph, let's go to you for a moment to talk about interoperability, which I hear frequently stated as an important goal. I believe it's an important goal, and it's also easier said than done, I think. So you've recently released a report, the Partnership on AI has, on interoperability. What do you see in terms of the current landscape, and where are some opportunities to improve upon the state of interoperability as it exists today?
I won't say too much because obviously we just want you to read the report, so I don't want to spoil it for you. Then you won't want to actually read it. But I think, as you said, interoperability is referenced in nearly every policy framework, not just related to AI, right? Other technologies, it's just used often, like let's be interoperable. And I think that's often like, what does that actually mean in practice? And so a lot of this paper is really just trying to break down that when we talk about interoperability, what does it mean? What does it mean to be but we focus largely on policy interoperability while recognizing there's technical interoperability, there's institutional interoperability or alignment, you could say too. And what we know is that, going back to AI frameworks in particular, we look at 8 policy frameworks internationally, including the G7 Hiroshima Code of Conduct. We look at the AI Act, et cetera, and note that they all reference that we should be interoperable, we should learning from similar and other policy frameworks. But we take documentation as a key example. So if we agree that there is an acknowledgement that we should all be in alignment, let's take one thing that we can also agree, I think, that is important, which is documentation. And to what extent do each of these policy frameworks talk about documentation in the same way? So when we talk about like pre-deployment documentation, such as technical documentation, and downstream documentation, where is that referenced? We see it in the AI Act, we see it in the G7 Hiroshima Code of Conduct. When we talk about post-deployment documentation and we talk about incident monitoring, where is that referenced? We also look at small discrepancies, and I should say John looks at these specific discrepancies here, where the AI Act, for example, talks about the preparation and publication of training data and making that publicly accessible, whilst the G7 Hiroshima Code of Conduct talks about preparing it, but not necessarily making it public. So there's this, small like details that might be different. But I think what we really wanted to understand is why is it important that a lot of these documentation artifacts are referenced in the same way, including what the expectations are, both in the way that we understand the need and their role for achieving kind of safety benefits and accountability. So we need documentation. I know transparency is often also used as a buzzword, but documentation is a core component of achieving transparency. And so why is that important? And we also do recognize, of course, the economic benefits, but more so talking about the need to establish good documentation practices as a kind of baseline. What does that mean? And then how do we see policymakers reference and expect that in frameworks? So I think what we see is that the policy framework is very light and touch when they talk about documentation specifically. And we talk about the need for there to be the building out of these frameworks. So if the G7 has agreed to kind of build out the code of conduct, what could we hope to see in terms of fleshing it out and building more detail? But if the G7 is going to add in detail, how should the G7, for example, be talking to the EU as it thinks about the code of practice and is also thinking about documentation artifacts? So there's an opportunity here. We see a few policy windows where the G7 and the EU, for example, being ahead of the curve, could align together. We, of course, note the fact that as new institutions are stood up, including the scientific panel, what will their role be over time, and the need to kind of bring them into that discussion and the need to kind of continue that alignment. And then I think the last point, which you'll, of course, hear from PAI, which we think is really important, is that who's going to be part of the discussion as well, including what will the basis of what we make interoperable be, and who will decide. So just a few points, but please, I will stop there because you're just hopefully supposed to read the report when it's out.
We will all read the report. And I think, Steph, what it gets to at a higher level is that unless we have implementation reference points that have been developed in an inclusive way and we can all look at and say that represents best practice, it's very hard to know what good looks like. It's very hard to have a shared sense of what's acceptable or not. And so this interoperability work and as much as possible trying to really, understand whether there are good reasons for that little divergence or whether that's actually just going to become the next painful thing for a small or emerging business, a startup, to have to navigate. These are really, really important questions, I think, to having a shared sense of what we should expect. We need those shared implementation reference points. All right, I want to give everyone a heads up that we are going to take questions. I think we've seen some interest in questions already from the audience. So start thinking about what you would like to ask. And in the meantime, I've got one more question for 1C. I do think Singapore has played a really important role both in the global governance conversations, contributing to the views about whether UN can fit into the picture. But I think Singapore has also played a uniquely regional role as well. So the UN role, Singapore, in case not everyone is aware, has had an important role in leading some of the digital discussions that a group called the FOSS group of states, the Forum on Small States, has led. And regionally, of course, Singapore plays a key role in ASEAN. So love to hear from you, Wansi, some of Singapore's priorities on the global governance front, and also how you think Singapore can sort of play that role in bridging between, the global and fully international conversations and the more regional conversations that are taking place.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. Thanks for setting this up in terms of explaining FOSS and ASEAN. Maybe before I talk about that, I'll just talk about what we do globally. We work very closely with the US on the AI Safety Institute and the network, and how do we move things forward. We participate in a lot of interoperable kind of discussions. And I just want to add to what Stephanie said, that in order to be interoperable, you do need to have something. You need to have a point of view already, and you need to get into quite a lot of detail. So when we looked at the NIST AIRMF, for example, right, we are the first to have a crosswalk between Singapore and NIST on the AIRMF, and you have to get into the 5.6.7 requirement, right, and really understand where we're the same and where we're different. And I think what we're trying to do with regards to interoperability is really come to hopefully agree that we are generally aligned in many, many, many things. And where are we aligned in all these many, many things? We recognize that everybody will be a little bit different. Our contexts are different, our societies are different. There'll be additional requirements. But as long as we get some alignment at the basic, at the universal things, hopefully it'll be easier for companies, for organizations who are operating globally. So that's what we're pushing for in terms of interoperability. And we've done it with G7, NIST, we're doing with some of the ISO frameworks as well. But coming back to what Singapore does internationally, we participate in a lot of platforms, not because we are FOMO. Maybe we are a little bit FOMO, but no, maybe not so much. But because I think it's important to add a certain voice. I think we come from Asia. Like Natasha said, we sort of have our region, which is ASEAN. We are small countries, so the digital forum, the Forum for Small States is helpful in sort of highlighting some of the issues that small countries face. Small countries have limited data sets. Small countries have limited influence globally, not just with big countries, but also with big companies, right? So how do we come together and address these problems? So we participate in all these platforms so that we could hopefully then provide that note, right? Both from the FOSS perspective as well from ASEAN and other maybe kind of representations that we could have in these platforms. So in ASEAN, again, no fragmentation, common rules of the road, norms, and so on. We developed a common ASEAN guide on AI governance. Again, it's a point of view that we hope that we can then bring in global discussions. That's why I said, if you want to interoperate, you must have your own point of view, right? With FOSS, tomorrow, yes, but I think I can say this. We're launching an AI playbook for small states. And as everybody said, it's not just about safety and governance. We also want to think about opportunities, about how do we bring together the lessons that we have from these 100 over small countries. The definition is about 10 million and less population, spans the world from Africa to Asia to Latin America, Europe. Different levels of development. You have European small states that are very advanced, and then the rest. And we all have our own kind of lessons that we can bring to bear. And that's really what the playbook is. It's about pulling together these useful experiences so that we can share a living document. More information will be added as we go along. But that's the kind of work that I think in Singapore we hope to sort of bring to the global discussions beyond our own points of view, because we have also what Singapore thinks is important. And we contribute both technically, at the policy level, at the capacity building level. So quite a lot of different tiers in terms of participation. And I probably want to end with, when we talk about G2G, we talk about governments, but actually a lot of these conversations also have to be done at the industry level. We need to have that discussion among companies, organizations, and that's why for us, I guess I don't sleep, right? Because I'm here. But at the organizational level, we set up the AI Verify Foundation as a mechanism, open source mechanism to bring in these conversations at organizations level. And that's one way in which we hope, again, the note, dealing with governments, dealing with global platforms, dealing with our companies, we hope that we can then try and pull again the strings together, and hopefully we can then, all of us benefit from a less fragmented world.
Thanks, Wamsi. I do think Singapore is playing that role of being sort of supercharger in the node of international governance, and we're grateful for that. All right, let's open up to questions or comments or observations from the floor. Well, Julie, I saw you raise your hand early, so we'll start with you.
I'm Julie Brown. I'm Australia's online safety regulator.
Oh, sorry.
What's interesting is that regulators are kind of where the rubber hits the road on enforcement. And we haven't been included in a lot of these discussions. And I know the AI safety institutes vary from country to country in terms of what role that they'll take on. And in Australia right now, we have the benefit of looking at what other countries are doing. So we've got 4 digital regulators that are quite active. So we've got domain expertise. Then we're looking at framework or potentially comprehensive. So where do you see the role of regulators playing in this? Because principles and frameworks are so important, but unless they're implemented consistently and have an enforcement backstop, then I don't think we're going to have consistency. So that's my first question. That leads into, what are the discussions around open source AI? This is where we have standards pending before Parliament, where we're seeing proliferation of notification apps, and there are very little, if any, guardrails, not only on the developments in the apps themselves, but also with the platforms and libraries. So I'm just curious to how you're thinking about open source AI versus proprietary.
Who would like to jump in?
I can jump in on the regulator discussion first, since we are a regulator as well. IMDA regulates online safety. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and definitely the role of regulators is very important. The question is, when does regulation come in? When do the regulators come in? At the beginning, or somewhere when we have decided where the rules are clear, where the thresholds, what good looks like is clear. So a few things we do. Within the IMDA, I work very closely with my colleagues from online safety. One of the questions that we have, where the intersection of AI is, on the content side, what do you worry about that I then need to figure out on the AI side in terms of content? I have to detect, I have to check for in terms of what the large models generate. And that's that minimally one conversation that we're already having with my colleagues who sits on the same floor as me, just on the other side of the building. We also have a lot of conversations with other regulators in the sectors, healthcare, financial services, employment, because again, it's about making sure that at least within the ecosystem, we are coherent and coordinated. Let's not ask for different things that is difficult for all companies who operate in all of these different sectors. But at the same time, recognizing what additional requirements we need for these sectors that we could bring in. I suppose it's clear, regulators are important. I think for AI, it's a matter of time. I mean, there's UI Act. Singapore, we're not regulating at the horizontal level, but we're working so closely with our existing legislation already, the existing regulators, to make sure that what we already have in healthcare and financial services and online safety and everything else could be beefed up to address the AI question.
Jump in.
Yes, please.
First, we appreciate the partnership with the government of Australia. Also, just to note that NIST, where the AI Safety Institute is housed, is a non-regulatory agency, so I can't comment on the U.S. regulation. But part of the network, as Wamsi says, has partners who are regulators. I would just say that if a government was to regulate, that regulation or the stipulations, the implementation of those regulations are based on something. So for the EU AI Act, it's based on standards, and Sebastian is in the audience, who's leading that effort. Those standards are scientifically, arrived upon, and so this network of scientific government-backed institutes who are working on AI safety, the hope is that will sort of lead into those types of endeavors, which, again, others could sort of use that as they're authorized to do.
Yes, please.
So there's been some mention of different policy frameworks. And I know I'll read the reports. But also analogies to other sectors, right? People have talked about climate and IPCC. There's, of course, everyone wants to build their own mini nuclear plant to fund their, and so nuclear regulation is coming back in vogue as a thing to discuss. Are there, as you build out these interoperability and you're looking at policy, are there other analogous frameworks you've seen in other sectors that you think are actually useful as comparators, if not perfect, but sort of approximately, to understand what to do about policy interoperability in an AI context?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic question, and something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. What are some really, really good examples? Maybe one, which is maybe not a snazzy one, we looked at telecoms, for example, and I think that was largely thinking about the links between kind of legislation and standards and the way that they have worked over time and have also worked for different stages of telecoms, so kind of 4G, 5G, now thinking about 6G, and the clear link, if you just look at the European level, between sort of ETSI, the role that Senelec plays, and the telecoms agencies and government and legislation, that has worked, I think, over time. I'm seeing a lot of nodding, so I'm hoping people are agreeing with me. But at the same time, I don't know if we have the same challenges when it comes to, I think, what we are, the space we're in now, where we need this new layer for continuous horizon scanning for kind of new risks. Or more research. And so it was difficult, I think, to find a perfect example where I think there are a lot of things we can borrow from thinking about telecoms, but to what extent our understanding of the risks are the same, I think is a bit different. So probably a few examples, and maybe that's a good example that we could learn from, but it isn't exactly the same. And so there are some nuances that we therefore need to pay attention to, and I think it kind of goes back to Natasha's example that we recognize now that this network approach that I think the UN has acknowledged is actually really important, that there's not just going to be probably one seamless model actually in this instance versus telecoms, where you could probably draw it on paper and it might stay the same. So it's more just about having mechanisms to drive linkages over time, and that's probably something we need to put more emphasis on. So hopefully that answered your question, Suresh.
And unfortunately, I think we're out of time to take any further questions now. But Suresh, I did just want to offer, with my Microsoft hat on, a reference to a work that we did where we studied a number of different global governance institutions in multiple different dimensions. And I think, some of the aviation and other case studies that we cited in there provide some good examples for thinking about interoperability as well. All right, very last question for our panelists in just 30 seconds. I would love to hear one thing that you would like to see happen on the global governance front between now and perhaps one of the next most important sort of milestones in this journey, which will be the French AI Action Summit in February. So Steph, I'll go to you first.
I was kind of hoping that you'd come to me last. What do I actually want to say on this? I think I wanted to say, yes, that we need to be thinking about responsibilities quite carefully and not think about sort of binary options. Maybe it goes back to this point around the fact that we have this complex picture, and I think it will probably remain the same. So I think about responsibilities, and it kind of goes back to what Julie mentioned on open versus closed. And I know we didn't directly respond to your question, but when you think about that, it's not just open versus closed, but it's really thinking about responsibilities and how those responsibilities might change. And what are the responsibilities if we're thinking about the landscape of these various institutions, and how do I understand my role versus the role of another entity, and how do those come together? And so, yeah, I think thinking ahead to France, and I'm very excited for what Anne will say, at the end of today, it will be around how can we create mechanisms to think about responsibilities and not think it has to be either or think about a lot of questions in a binary way.
Thanks, Steph. 1C.
I think France is not that far away. It's just a few months away.
Yes.
So let's be practical. And it's always in Singapore. It's always let's be practical. I think I think we hope that at least with the AI Safety Institute network,
Yes.
that we can land something that is tangible, that we can agree on something. I mean, we're talking about evaluation methods, how we do things, even agreeing on what risks we care about. I think hopefully that's something that we can do clearly by November and demonstrate something in France in terms of how we can do this together. I mean, for Singapore, even though the network's only like 10 plus 1, is it? Yeah, about 11 safety, this changes a little bit, but 11 safety institutes. What we hope to bring is beyond the common kind of issues that we all face, as we talked about earlier, right? Representing regions, representing other countries. So we hope we can represent, at least in Asia, in ASEAN, some of the concerns that they have. And things like multicultural, multilingual issues around AI models is something that I think we hope to at least be able to bring to the network again to discuss. We're organizing, before the network, we're organizing a red teaming effort, talking to Microsoft and a few other big model developers, but also with 9 other countries in Asia, bringing everybody together in Singapore to do a red teaming around culture and language, mostly to build up understanding what are different countries' priorities, but also to hopefully develop some kind of common ways in which we can address this moving forward. Because a one-time activity is not going to be good enough, but really it's the start of something, the seed of creating that network of people, as well as the seed of building capacity.
Take us home, Mark.
Okay. Well, Wansi, you said most of it. So let me just say that I would like to see a successful launch of the International Network of Safety Institutes in November. But more to the point, what we're doing there really is trying to discover how to make the whole of that network greater than the sum of its parts. And that can only be done with both the members, other countries, countries from all regions of the world, and civil society, academia, and the private sector, basically everyone in this room. And so, in sort of cultivating that input, we hope to come up with some tangible things to lead into the French summit, which we are certainly linked up with.
Well, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists in this conversation.